Last time we spoke about the Soviet conflicts of the 1930s. In the aftermath of World War I, Germany descended into chaos, setting the stage for Adolf Hitler's rise to power. Seizing on public disillusionment, he dismantled democracy and expanded German territory, straining relations across Europe. Concurrently, Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union embarked on rapid industrialization under his five-year plans, marred by brutal purges that instilled fear amongst citizens. The intertwining of these authoritarian regimes heightened tensions, leading to conflict throughout the continent. Amidst all this turmoil, the Soviets engaged in several key conflicts with neighboring states, particularly in Manchuria, Xinjiang, and Finland. The rivalry with Japan over territories culminated in some fierce skirmishes, especially at Lake Khasan and Khalkhin-Gol, where the Red Army showcased its capabilities. Ultimately, the political upheavals and territorial ambitions of both Hitler and Stalin set the stage for a global conflict that would become World War II, reshaping the world's landscape forever. This episode is Prelude number 7, the Spanish Civil War. Well, hello there. Welcome back to the Eastern Front Week by Week podcast, and I'm your dutiful host, Craig Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. Over on YouTube, I recently released an episode covering the Battle for the Great Wall of China in 1933. And over on Echoes of War, we released a podcast covering the American plans to invade Canada in the 1920s and the 1930s. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And actually, as I'm recording this right now, I just released the latest exclusive podcast episode, and it is on the government by assassination period in Japanese history. That's 1920s, 1930s Japan, when young officers in the military began assassinating just about any official they had to get what they wanted. It's truly a bloody affair. So if that's of interest to you, please go check it out. Well, hello again. Today we're going to be delving into the Spanish Civil War, an event many came to refer to as the dress rehearsal of World War II. And yes, I can hear some groans from you historians out there. They hate when you say that one. Now, Spain had been marked by political instability. The monarchy, which had ruled for centuries, faced growing discontent in the early 20th century. The abdication of King Alfonso XIII in 1931 led to the establishment of the Second Spanish Republic. The new government was characterized by its progressive reforms, such as land redistribution, labor rights, and secularization of education. However, this alienated conservative and religious sectors of society, particularly the military, the Catholic Church, and landowners. Spain's societal structure was also sharply divided. The rural population, especially in the south, struggled with poverty, illiteracy, and oppressive landlordism. The rise of labor unions and anarchist movements sought to address these inequalities but faced violent repression from the authorities. Within the urban areas, a burgeoning middle class had emerged, advocating for political and economic reforms. The class between the conservative force, defending the status quo, and the leftist groups pushing for change created a highly polarized environment. The 1930s saw the rise of extremist ideologies in Spain. On the left, there was the Spanish Socialist Workers' Party, or the PSOE, and anarchist groups like the Confederación Nacional del Trabajo, or CNT, who both gained a lot of momentum. Over on the right, there was factions such as the monarchists, conservative politicians, and fascist movements like the Falange, who emerged promoting a return to traditional values and a strong centralized authority. This ideological struggle exacerbated existing tensions and laid the groundwork for conflict. To be honest, there's a lot more groups involved in this, but I simply can't jump into the rabbit hole that was politics on the eve of the Spanish Civil War. It is absolutely nuts. The global economic crisis of the 1930s further strained Spain. Unemployment soared and agricultural prices plummeted, leading to widespread hardship. The government's attempts to implement reforms and stabilize the economy were met with resistance from conservative factions, who feared losing their privileges and power. Economic instability fueled social unrest, causing strikes and protests to become more frequent and more violent. Attempts to create a broad-based coalition government in the Republic faced significant challenges. The government switched between various political alignments, leftist coalitions, moderate governments, and power-sharing arrangements, each unable to effectively address the rising tensions. The fragmentation of political parties into competing factions made governance increasingly difficult, leading to a power vacuum that extremist groups would exploit. As political tensions escalated, both sides began forming armed militias. The left established groups like the Juventud Socialista and the Iberian Anarchist Federation, or FAI, while the right saw the rise of the Spanish Legion and the later Carlists. These militias often clashed on the streets, increasing violence and fear amongst the populace. It's a little bit similar to what we had talked about in the Weimar Republic, just many more groups fighting. In the 6 years leading up to the Spanish Civil War, which would erupt in 1936, Spain experienced the rule of 3 military dictators and witnessed one failed revolution. These 3 were all military men who had been appointed by the king to the office of prime minister. All 3 men had varying degrees of power. The first was Miguel Primo de Rivera. He was a classical dictator who controlled the country for about 7 years. His successor was Damaso Berenguer, often described as a toothless dictator. And the last man before the establishment of the Republic in 1931 was Juan Batista Anzar Cabañas. He had all the potential power of de Rivera, but allowed it to slip away and the Republic to form. The country was deeply divided along partisan lines, which undermined any sense of national unity. The attempted revolution of 1933 was mainly instigated by extreme left-wing parties in reaction to the electoral success of right-wing politicians. Although this revolution initially gained traction in various regions, it was ultimately suppressed, albeit with some challenges. Many leaders within the Spanish army began to view the leftist parties as threats to security and stability, fearing they would contribute to the country's disintegration. This perspective fueled agitation amongst the military and government figures. These agitators did not share a single political ideology. Instead, they encompassed a diverse range of right-wing beliefs, including fascism, Catholic supremacy, and various aspects of just loving the monarchy. These groups are very broad labels encompassing several distinct philosophies and political movements within themselves. In the context of the Spanish Civil War, the fascists were probably closer in fashion to the Italians than that of the Nazis. The Catholic supremacists believed in the supremacy of the national church and its role in governing morality and society in conjunction with the monarchy. In the monarchist camp, there were 2 main movements. The first was the Carlists, who supported the claim of Don Carlos, the Count of Molina. The second was the Alfonsists, who supported the restoration of the last king, Alfonso XIII. In the 1936 elections, the left-leaning parties emerged victorious, leading to a hell of a lot of unrest. This turmoil was partly caused by their supporters, who celebrated excessively, engaging in acts of burning and looting. The new government faced a difficult choice regarding the restoration of order, as they wanted to avoid appearing too oppressive to those supporting them. However, they recognized the necessity of military backing both to reestablish order and to govern effectively. Within weeks of the election and the subsequent chaos, a national conspiracy began to take shape. By the mid-1930s, discontent amongst the military was palpable, obviously due to perceived leftist policies that threatened traditional military values. A significant group of military officers, including Generals Francisco Franco, Emilio Mola, and José Sanjurjo, they began plotting to seize power. Francisco Franco Bahamonde was born on December 4th of 1892 in Ferrol, a naval city in the northwest parts of Spain. Coming from a military family, he entered the Spanish army at a very young age. He quickly rose through the ranks due to his exceptional capabilities as a soldier and a tactician. By the 1920s, Franco had made a name for himself during Spain's colonial campaigns in Morocco, where he distinguished himself as a ruthless and effective leader over the Spanish Foreign Legion. Franco was initially appointed to lead the Spanish military in Morocco. The conspiracy he would take a leading role in was fueled by discontent with the Republican government, which they viewed as ineffective and dangerously leftist. The conspirators aimed to initiate a coup that would restore Spain to conservative and monarchist rule. The plan was to coordinate a series of uprisings across the country, with the initial uprising scheduled for July 18th of 1936. The conspirators expected immediate military support and a swift victory. However, they encountered various levels of resistance and complexity, significantly complicating their plans. Thus, on July 17th of 1936, a military coup began in Spanish Morocco, led by General Juan Yague, supported by some right-wing groups. Franco's response was pivotal. He received support from the Army of Africa, and he used this to launch a substantial military campaign. Franco led a successful landing on the mainland, and unrest spread quickly to other regions, particularly in the north and the south of Spain. While some military garrisons were initially successful in their coup attempts, many urban areas and regions aligned with leftist parties, such as Catalonia and Madrid, resisted, resulting in fierce fighting and chaos. As a military rebellion took shape, Spain was fractured into two main factions: the Nationalists, led by Franco, aspiring to establish a fascist government, and the Republicans, comprising various leftist groups, including communists, anarchists, and socialists who wanted to defend the Republic. Yes, when you have anarchists working with socialists and communists, you know that something's up. Within months, hundreds of thousands of volunteers from diverse backgrounds around the globe rushed to fight for both sides. By late 1936, organized military units began to operate within the country. The Germans were the first to provide substantial military aid. This assistance began in the early days of the attempted coup. Starting around July 29th, the newly formed Luftwaffe began ferrying troops and supplies from the nationalist base in Morocco to areas in Spain under their control. Over the next 2 weeks, they successfully transported at least 10,000 of Franco's finest troops from the Army of Africa, which he had commanded when the war had erupted. Although more personnel and equipment were intended to cross the Strait of Gibraltar, most of the small Spanish navy remained loyal to the Republican government. To address this, Hitler sent the Panzerschiffs Deutschland and Admiral Scheer to escort Franco's transports. These ships were formidable, equipped with greater firepower than anything the Spanish navy could possibly deploy, especially after the defection of its best vessel, the Canarias. The Canarias was a Spanish-built version of the Royal Navy's County-class heavy cruisers. She was modified for the needs of the Spanish Navy, but otherwise was similar to her British cousin. However, she was exactly the sort of ship that the Kriegsmarines had in mind as prey when they designed the Panzerschiffs. While the Spanish Navy did possess dreadnoughts such as the España and Yami I, these older pre-World War I designs had not been sufficiently modernized, and they were thus outclassed by the Panzerschiffs. The German cruisers effectively deterred any threats during the initial transfers across the Strait of Gibraltar. Benito Mussolini was keen to join the conflict because, of course, he would be. This guy, as they said, had eyes way too big for his stomach. If you want to learn more about that, please check out my 10-episode-long series on the North African campaign, which can be found at Echoes of War, where Mussolini failed to attack the British in Egypt. Then he failed to attack the Greeks in Greece. He actually lost to them, which is a hilarious conflict. And honestly, everything the Italians did in World War II just made things worse for Germany. But I desist. Benito Mussolini was keen to join the conflict, seeing it as an opportunity to increase Italian influence in the Mediterranean and showcase the strength of his brand new military. In the early weeks of the war, he ordered 90 aircraft to be sent to the nationalist forces, but the delivery took longer than expected. The Luftwaffe's airlift of Franco's troops included some Italian pilots flying their own transport planes. Furthermore, additional Italian naval units took part in the ongoing convoy escort missions. The United Kingdom was apprehensive about the leftist Republican government, with many of its leaders secretly backing the nationalist cause. Tensions within the British Empire were already high, and the threat of a civil war in the Mediterranean added to the strain, potentially destabilizing the delicate balance of power in Europe. Consequently, they quickly sought to establish a non-intervention pact amongst global powers, which required weeks of diplomatic negotiations. Ultimately, the French, Germans, Italians, Soviets, and United States, and even smaller nations like Belgium and Czechoslovakia, reached a non-intervention agreement, along with the formation of a committee to oversee compliance. However, this turned out to be little more than a facade, as the League of Nations was ineffective at enforcing the agreement. Meanwhile, Hitler and Mussolini capitalized on the inaction of the other powers, intensifying their aggressive support for the Nationalists. As weeks progressed into months, German and Italian support escalated far beyond what General Franco had initially requested during the early stages of the coup attempt. The Germans established the Condor Legion, equipped with the Luftwaffe's most advanced weaponry. The Ju-52 transport became the backbone of the Legion, originally developed from a civilian aircraft designed for passengers and cargo. It was repurposed for military applications and later became one of the most iconic planes used by the Wehrmacht in their campaigns of conquest throughout Europe and Africa. Another Junkers model, the Ju-87 Stuka, also made its debut in the Spanish skies. Heinkel's notorious He-111 was also deployed, conducting attacks on Republican airfields and terrorizing civilians, particularly in Guernica. The bombing of Guernica is one of the most infamous military actions of the entire Civil War. The Basque region, seeking autonomy and opposing Franco's dictatorship, aligned with the Republicans. Guernica, the capital of the Basque country, thus became a key location due to its political and symbolic significance. On the afternoon of April 26 of 1937, the Condor Legion executed an aerial bombing campaign against Guernica. The operation began at around 4:30 p.m. and would last for several hours. The German Air Force, under the pretext of supporting Franco's troops, targeted the town with a combination of high-explosive bombs and incendiary devices. The planes carried out repeated bombing runs aiming to create chaos and instill terror amongst the civilian population. The town was largely undefended with no significant military presence, which made it an easy target. The attack resulted in widespread destruction of buildings, including homes, shops, and the town's historical structures. The use of incendiaries led to fires that would consume large segments of Guernica. The casualty figures from the bombing vary, with estimates ranging from hundreds to over 1,000 civilian deaths. The attack not only caused physical destruction, but it also left a deep psychological scar on the civilian population. Many residents were forced to flee, and the raid led to significant disruption in the local community. The bombing of Guernica shocked the world, and it garnered international condemnation. It highlighted the devastating impact of modern warfare on civilians, and it raised awareness about the atrocities committed during the Spanish Civil War. The event served as a vivid example of the moral implications of war tactics and the lengths to which regimes might go further for their objectives. Guernica's bombing inspired powerful artistic responses, most famously Pablo Picasso's painting Guernica, created in 1937. I'm sure many of you have seen this very famous picture. It's the one of the person holding their face and screaming. It depicts the horror of the bombing, and it became an iconic symbol of the tragedies of the war, reflecting the suffering and the chaos experienced by the civilian victims. Picasso's work helped bring global attention to the Spanish Civil War, exemplifying how art can influence public perception and political discourse. Now, the He-111 was not the sole or even the majority type used in the bombing of Guernica, but it is perhaps the most recognizable, and it served as a very useful stand-in for the narrative imagery. Lastly, I should mention the Bf-109 fighter, which would ultimately become the second most produced military aircraft in history, with approximately 30,000 units manufactured during its production run, was involved. The Bf-109's origins can be traced back to the mid-1930s when the German Air Ministry sought a modern fighter to replace its outdated biplanes in service. In response, Willy Messerschmitt, the chief designer of the Bayerische Flugzeugwerke, began designing a sleek, low-wing monoplane with a focus on speed, agility, and firepower. The aircraft's first prototype, the Bf-109 V1, took to the skies in September of 1935. It was powered by a Rolls-Royce Kestrel engine, which provided adequate performance for testing. However, the design quickly evolved to incorporate a more powerful engine, leading to the Bf-109 V2 prototype featuring a Junkers Humo 210 engine. This modification enhanced performance, setting the stage for subsequent variants. By 1937, the Bf-109 entered mass production, with the initial variant being the Bf-109B. This model was primarily used for training purposes. However, it was the Bf-109E, or AMID, introduced in 1939 that would establish the aircraft's reputation as a formidable fighter. Featuring a much more powerful Daimler-Benz DB601 engine and improved armaments, including 4 7.92mm MG-17 machine guns and the option for a 20mm MG-FF cannon, the Bf-109E became the very backbone of the Luftwaffe during the Battle of Britain. The Condor Legion operated only with a limited number of squadrons of aircraft, but its impact on the war was significant owing to the overall inadequacy of the air forces on both sides. The Republican government had a disjointed assortment of aircraft types from various nations, which hampered the effectiveness of their air force, as their logistics, training, and capabilities remained fragmented throughout the conflict. Additionally, the Germans deployed officers from every branch of the Wehrmacht, not only to observe and advise the nationalist forces, but also to learn from their experiences. The Luftwaffe contributed the most to the Condor Legion and consequently received the majority of the advisory roles. This included leadership positions like of Field Marshal Hugo Spell, who would later be known for his command in defending occupied Europe against the combined bomber offensive. The main analysis of the combat was led by General Helmuth Wilbach, who was recognized as both a skilled theorist and an effective commander. His staff included several distinguished individuals, such as future field marshals and generals, Lieutenant General Adolf Galland, serving as a squadron commander, who would ultimately be credited with 104 confirmed kills during the World War, Field Marshal Wolfram von Richthofen, who held the position of Chief of Staff before becoming the commander of a legion in Spain, whence he orchestrated the bombing of Guernica. Additionally, General Wilhelm Ritter von Thoma oversaw a small ground combat unit of the Condor Legion. The ground combat forces of the Condor Legion were relatively small and had minimal impact on the war's outcome. When the Legion was withdrawn, about 400 tank crew badges were awarded throughout the entire campaign. However, it's important to note that there were never 400 tank crews present at any given time in Spain under the Condor Legion. Such a number would have represented a significant contribution, far exceeding what Hitler would have permitted at the time. 400 Panzer I tanks would require 800 crew members, as each tank needed 2, while Panzer II tanks needed 3 crew members each. And this figure doesn't even account for the personnel required for repairs and maintenance. Ultimately, the support provided by the Condor Legion was overshadowed by the Italian contribution. At its peak, the Corpo Truppe Volontarie had over 750 aircraft and 75,000 troops in Spain fighting alongside Franco. The Italians were consistently the strongest supporters of either side during the Spanish Civil War, actively working to secure Franco's victory. This was mostly because Mussolini was an ardent supporter of Franco, unlike Hitler, who saw the Civil War as a means to distract the Western democracies from his build-up and preparations for conquering Europe. On the flip side, the Republicans faced difficulties in securing support from other countries. The French provided a few aircraft initially, but further assistance was halted due to political tensions in Paris. Meanwhile, the British and Americans remained committed to non-intervention pacts. Volunteers from around the globe offered their help, though they supplied minimal material support. Although the Soviet Union formally agreed to a non-intervention policy, it also sent substantial aid to the Republican forces discreetly. Stalin navigated a delicate situation by openly disregarding the agreement while attempting to maintain diplomatic relations with France and Britain to counter Hitler's influence. By October of 1936, Stalin appointed Jan Berzin to lead the Red Army's small yet expanding advisory mission to Spain. Berzin, a high-ranking military intelligence officer, reflected the nature of Stalin's strategy, as a general was not chosen for the role. At this time, one of the main concerns was the internal security of the military. The generals of the Red Army were wary of overseas engagements that involved independent military commands and the potential for interacting with politically unreliable foreigners. Stalin was in the early stages of his Great Purge, and Berzin himself would become a victim of it in 1937. The Soviets insisted that the Republican forces cover the cost for the equipment being sent to them, leading to the transfer of the country's gold reserves to Moscow. This transfer was officially for safekeeping, but the reality was quite different. The Soviets tapped into their reserves to finance the equipment, applying exchange rates that primarily benefited Moscow. In contrast, the Germans and Italians provided most of their assistance either at no cost or in exchange for future concessions, which Franco was eager to grant. In the final months of 1936, the Soviet Union significantly increased its support by sending a substantial amount of equipment and personnel to Spain. Although exact figures are challenging to determine, during those early months, Soviet contributions far surpassed those of the fascist dictators. However, this disparity did not last, and the Soviet Union would later fall behind in its support. The aid provided the Republicans with a mixed quality. Some of the equipment was exceptional, outperforming much of the aid from Germany and Italy. The Soviet T-26 tank is a prime example. It consistently outperformed the Nationalist counterparts. In the air, however, the situation was much more complex. Initially, the Polikarpov I-16 excelled against the first fascist fighters, that being the Heinkel HE-51 and the Arado AR-68. Yet these biplanes were obviously outdated, and the newer Messerschmitt Bf-109s posed a serious challenge to the rather bulky Polikarpov. In total, the Republicans received approximately 680 planes from the Soviet Union and manufactured an additional 250 using Soviet designs. The Soviet Union's contributions fluctuated annually, influenced by political dynamics in Moscow, as Stalin executed his purges and expressed concerns about alienating potential allies. By 1938, Stalin was believed to have recognized that a Republican victory would likely lead to the Soviet Union's isolation from Europe, resulting in future allies collaborating with Hitler and Mussolini to bolster the anti-Comintern Pact. Regardless of whether this outcome was genuinely probable, it's significant that Stalin adapted his policies in responses to these perceived threats. Now, one of the enduring myths about the foreign involvement in the Spanish Civil War is that it served as a testing ground for the combined arms strategies that would eventually be employed in World War II. I.e., that little joke I made at the very beginning of this episode, that's why historians, they hate when you call it a dress rehearsal. This misconception crumbles under more thorough investigations. The military strategies employed in the Spanish Civil War were not as advanced or organized as those that would emerge in World War II. The Nationalists and Republicans struggled with command structure, logistics, and coordination. The concept of combined arms, integrating infantry, armor, artillery, and air support, was never fully realized in Spain. Units often operated in isolation, and the effective coordination between different branches was very limited. The ideological nature of the conflict shifted military priorities significantly. Both sides were more focused on achieving political objectives rather than developing cohesive military strategies. This ideological fervor, as we would say, overshadowed the operational needs of warfare and hindered the systematic integration of tactics. While the Spanish Civil War saw the introduction of aircraft, tanks, and other military technologies, the operational tactics to utilize these technologies effectively were very underdeveloped. The Germans tested their Luftwaffe tactics during the conflict, but the overall technological environment of the Spanish Civil War was rudimentary compared to that of the massive industrial war mechanisms seen in World War II. The strategies and doctrines developed in Spain were specific to the context of the conflict. For example, the use of tanks was often hampered by difficult terrain and a lack of coherent combined arms doctrine, leading to a reliance on infantry tactics instead. Likewise, the lessons learned from the Spanish Civil War were more or less ignored by the major powers once World War II commenced. Instead, military planners in various countries, particularly Germany, evolved their tactics independently. At no point did either side possess a sufficient number of tanks to form the mass maneuver units that characterized the French and German armored divisions of 1940. Moreover, the notion of blitzkrieg was never an official doctrine of the Wehrmacht. General Franco did not align well with the Wehrmacht's ideal of a commanding officer. He was methodical, slow, and overly engrossed in political and diplomatic matters compared to the more decisive and insular German officer corps. Consequently, German officers of the Heer offered him minimal support and sometimes even campaigned against him with Hitler. The Republican forces lacked the discipline and unified command present in the Red Army, which was effectively utilized in the later years of World War II. They also faced the internal strife from various political factions that disrupted operations in Spain and continued to affect the war effort. I mean, let's be honest, you're talking about a coalition of liberals, socialists, communists, and anarchists. They were not going to get along. Overall, neither the German Heer nor the Red Army showed much interest in the conflict in Spain. Many prominent figures considered it at best a distraction and at worst a potential threat to their careers. The NKVD was extremely active in Spain in this period. They were led by Colonel Orlov. He helped initiate the Great Purge in the military mission to Spain in 1937, only to become a victim of the purge himself. But he would flee to the United States, where he lived until his death in 1973. While in charge of the NKVD in Spain, he conducted a terror campaign to filter out any suspected Trotskyites within the ranks of the Soviet military mission and the Republican forces. As a result, the lessons learned were primarily technical assessments of the equipment deployed in comparison to that of possible adversaries. Both Stalin and Hitler were careful to limit their military involvement in the war, recognizing it as a political risk and a potential drain on their land forces. They believed a larger war was imminent in Europe, and Spain's outcome would not significantly affect that situation. However, wasting thousands of tanks and aircraft while the army was attempting to expand could derail those preparations, potentially impacting the outcome for future conflicts. As for the military events that made up the Spanish Civil War, by July of 1936, the Nationalists quickly gained control of large swaths of Spain, particularly in the north and the west. They captured important urban centers, including Toledo and Salamanca. Upon gaining control of key territories, Franco consolidated power and established a military junta known as the National Defense Board. Simultaneously, the Republicans organized resistance against this. They quickly formed militias composed of anarchists, communists, and socialists aiming to counteract the coup. International brigades composed of volunteers from various countries arrived to support the Republican cause, emphasizing the ideological significance of the conflict. After initial successes, the Nationalists turned their attention to Madrid, hoping to capture the capital and decisively end the conflict altogether. The siege began in November of 1936, and the Republican forces mounted a staunch defense of the city, leading to intense urban warfare. The Nationalists employed heavy artillery and air support using the German Condor Legion, which bombed civilian targets such as Guernica in April of 1937, as we highlighted. The Battle for Madrid showcased the resilience of the Republicans, who managed to hold off the Nationalist advance despite facing severe shortages and internal conflict amongst their ranks. Ultimately, the siege would last until March of 1937, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Following the failure to take Madrid, Nationalist forces launched an offensive at Jarama Valley to cut off the Republican access to Madrid. The Battle for Jarama was marked by ferocious fighting, including trench warfare reminiscent of World War I. Republican troops managed to hold their ground, allowing for strategic withdrawals and regrouping despite losing thousands of soldiers in the process. In March, the Nationalist forces attempted to seize Guadalajara, but they were met with unexpected resistance from the international brigades and the Spanish Republican troops. The Republicans executed an effective counterattack, leading to significant Nationalist defeats, and showcasing the ability of the Republicans to rebound from key moments. The Nationalists next targeted northern regions of Spain, where Basque and Asturian provinces were undergoing heavy industrial development and had significant strategic resources. The Battle of Bilbao and the subsequent fall of the Basque country, alongside sieges of cities like Santander, resulted in the loss of critical territory for the Republicans. In late 1937, the Republicans launched an offensive to recapture Teruel, which was ultimately successful but left both sides depleted. The Nationalists counterattacked in early 1938 in a campaign to encircle the Republic, leading to a significant Nationalist victory in the critical Ebro River region. In the summer of 1938, the Republicans initiated a major offensive along the Ebro River, striving to regain the momentum and secure vital territory. The Nationalists responded with effective military tactics, ultimately leading to the encirclement and the decimation of the Republican forces. This battle culminated in the Republicans' retreat, signifying quite a turning point towards the Nationalist dominance. By early 1939, the Republican position had become increasingly untenable. Nationalist forces launched successful offensives capturing cities like Barcelona and advancing into the heart of the Republican-held territories. On April 1st of 1939, Franco declared victory, leading to a dictatorship that would last until his death in 1975. Yeah, 1975. It also shocks me to remember how long he maintained power. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Pacific War Week by Week podcast and the Fall and Rise of China podcast, both written and narrated by me. And if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. And hey, if you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepecificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. The Spanish Civil War was quickly devolved into what basically was a proxy war between numerous great powers. For various reasons, many nations got involved to different degrees, and this ultimately led Franco to emerge victorious. Meanwhile, it also showcased the might of certain nations like Germany.